Okay. Okay.
So I'm going to turn this over to you right now.
Alrighty, and I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that and we're still here. All right, excellent. All right, so last year I did the presentation for spring management about the same time. I think it was the 9th of last January. And I was very maybe overly ambitious in everything that I wanted to teach and try to cram everything in. And I don't think either we ran out of time or we were really pressed for time. And I can't remember if we did the honey production portion of it. So I went back in, I kind of pared down the swarming part of it and not getting the nitty gritty details of that. But I do think it's really important to touch on swarming topic because I think that's still something that, a lot of people struggle with, and maybe they know what to do, but they just don't have the time to keep up with them. But anyway, so we're gonna just recap winter really quickly here just to get us to like March. The population size, mites, virus loads, moisture buildup, and honey stores, supplemental feed are the biggest issues during winter. And colonies should have built up well or combined in the fog. And so there's not much you can do at this point. If they did not do that, just cross your fingers and hope they make it. Mite treatments such as oxalic acid or hop guard can be done in the winter. They're not temperature dependent. So that this is a good time to hit them with that, and especially in January when the days, they start getting longer now. So the plants everything's, symbiotic there and connected. So they're going to follow the plants, and the plants follow the daylight. But then the mites are going to follow Q too. So quilt boxes and mountain camp method for feeding can be helpful to absorb moisture because again, they can withstand cold really well, but they cannot be wet and cold.
Jen, let me just jump in just 1 sec. You're sort of breaking up a little bit in your audio.
Oh no.
I don't know.
And I even tested this like beforehand to see if it was going to work. Is it still cutting in and out, or?
It's sort of kind of just choppy. I mean, it's a little bit of
What
feedback.
is going on with this?
No, we can't hear anything.
Yeah, I'm using the audio through the phone, and I'm using my phone for the video because my laptop is video is garbage.
Okay, just deal with it then.
I mean, I do have another microphone. Hold on. I don't know how well this will work, like, quickly here. This is what I use for my hybrid in-person stuff. Hopefully I won't. I'm going to lose the video here.
I still see you. Frozen, but still see you. Okay, well, we've totally lost you now. So, I mean, if that doesn't work, just.
You probably can't hear. Am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Woo! Okay, scared me. I had to disconnect. So I only have so many, they make these laptops nowadays with like no ports and stuff, and I had to stick it. Anyway, how's the audio now?
It's about the same. Just go. We'll just go with it. We'll just go with it.
All right. So insulation has proven to be more useful at the top of the hive because this is where the hot air is rising, and then the hot air meets cold surfaces, and then the condensation forms and drips back down on them. So you can wrap hives. They've done studies where, like it really didn't matter, basically, if you have a strong colony with a healthy colony with low mite loads, that's the most important thing there. Honey and winter supplements. Darker honey usually contains more ash, which can cause dysentery. There's not too much you can do about that, except for when you start seeing signs, of dysentery. I mean, that could be an indication. Well, you never want to be around a colony on a cleansing flight day. But if you start to see really noticeable signs of dysentery on the hive, that's not an indication of nosema. That's an indication of poor nutrition. And then the nosema gets spread because they're having accidents in the colony. So it gets spread quicker if they have it. Warm winter may cause more activity in brood rearing. That's not a bad thing. Having bees and having generations coming up behind each other is a good thing. You always want bees and baby making happening. But the problem is with more activity, they're going to go through their winter stores quicker. And so you have to keep an eye on that on their honey stores and then supplemental feed. Increased activity is going to cause them to eat more honey. If they're running low on honey, you want to feed the winter supplements. And then just real quick rundown on the supplements. That's just fondant, sugar brick, sugar cake, winter patty, and fondant there. Sugar slurry is a great emergency feed. We'll talk about that a little bit more in March segment here. And it's just really looks like a Slurpee mixture. It's just water mixed with sugar, and it's really convenient because you can pack it in the cells. And of course, then there's the dry sugar, the mountain camp method of feeding, which is also really useful for absorbing moisture. And that's that. I dump about 4 or 5 pounds in at a time, depending on the colony and the temperatures and everything. It's usually good for almost the whole winter, almost. And I also feed the fondant too. But then, March is a scary month. We'll talk about that more. January, February task. All right. So you want to remove snow and dead bees from the entrance, and upper entrance sheds can be helpful this time of year, especially if you have a yard that, is far away and you get a lot of snow and you can't get to it quickly. Then if we get a lot of snow, hopefully it's not snowing that much where it's blocking the upper entrance as well. So brood buildup begins again, and you want to start pollen patty supplements because the weather is just not going to be warm enough for them to go out and get the things that could possibly be budding and blooming. And so this is why we want to support the baby making, and they need that protein to be able to, feed the babies. Mid-February is generally when willow, oaks, and maples produce pollen, and there's a very small minor nectar flow. But again, the temps have to be good enough for them to go out to be able to get it. If you get a warm day, 50 degrees or higher, you can poke around in there a little bit and see what's happening and see, are they making babies, and where is the cluster located, and then you can move honey closer towards where you think the cluster is clustering. January, February is a good time to use oxalic acid and hop guard, like we mentioned, to kill the phoretic mites. That's the mites that are on the bees. And this is also a good time. You want to order your bees, do your inventory of equipment, continue your bee education, and strategize for next season. And what do they say? The best laid plans of mice and men. Good luck with trying to strategize with bees and the weather. Common causes of winter losses are going to be poor early fall population buildup, poor nutrition due to nectar dearth and lack of supplements, poor vitellogen in stores, lack of honey stores and winter supplements, heavy mite loads and viruses, nosema, tracheal mites, prolonged cold periods or extreme temps, because sometimes if it gets that cold, especially in January, sometimes they can't withstand it. Snow-covered entrances and poor ventilation, and of course, moisture buildup. So there's lots of reasons here, and it's never usually just one reason. It's a multitude of these which causes a hive to be a dead out. And this is a classic little softball. I call it the softball of death here. And then moisture has accumulated afterwards, and then the mold has started to form on that. Here's another. This one looked like it's kind of hard to tell without seeing the whole colony, but they probably died due to small cluster and or not enough honey stores. And this one's a no-brainer. Like it got wet and it's sad and disgusting. All right, spring management. So March is a very unpredictable and scary month for bees. A lot of hives die of starvation and or cold this time of year. Sugar slurry, like we talked about before, is a great emergency feed at this time because again, you can smush it into empty cells. And so it's right down there where the cluster is. It doesn't matter how many winter supplements that you put at the top of the hive, it's inaccessible to them while they're in cluster. They will not break cluster for anything, to eat, or they'll just stay there and freeze in that little ball. So with this sugar slurry mixture, down in the comb, hopefully they can access it easier down there. And brood production has increased. However, the weather is not usually conducive for foraging. And by this time, they've used all of their food stores, and you need to add winter supplements as necessary. And so I always, even if they have honey, I just throw in, sugar fondant. It's a really cheap insurance policy just to make sure that they have food, because they can die quickly within a matter of days if they do not have those carbohydrates.
Hey, Jen, question. So going back to stuffing the slurry into the
home,
into the cells, do you have concerns, busting up the cluster enough to get those frames out to be able to get that slurry close to it?
Well, obviously you want to do it on a day that's 50 degrees or higher and they're not going to be in a cluster.
Okay.
And then you can try to determine where you think they're hanging out. And you can usually tell because, like you'll see if there's any honey left, you'll see it like depleting around in that circle there. Right. And I redid the graphics for it was a graphic that was done, oh gosh, I forget his name now, Clarence something or other. It was a very old graphic about the winter cluster, and it's shared in many places, but it's such an old copy that I wanted to redo the graphics, and so I did that. And it kind of shows, like how, they form in there and where the pollen is and the honey and things like that. And so that's available on the website to check out. And so you'll know, where they're at in there. And then usually you're going to have some empty cells that you can pack in. And it's okay to put it over top of pollen. That's fine, because they put honey over top of pollen. You just wouldn't want to put it on top of babies. So open brood or cat brood. Obviously the cat brood's not empty cell, but yeah. So you should have some space in there to stick it.
Okay, thank you.
The next steps are going to depend upon freezing weather. And so at that time, once we think we're kind of out of the clear of freezing temperatures, never really in March, but you can remove your inner covers, your quilt boxes, install your feeders, and add a gallon of 1-to-1 sugar water feeding just to see, if they take it. And again, we're not out of the woods with the weather, so don't go like all crazy and make up batches and batches of sugar water. That comes later, that's in the summer. But in the spring, let's just see if they take it. And this is going to help them, again, ramp up their brood production, because the 1-to-1 mimics a nectar flow. Nectar is mostly water. And so this is going to encourage them, to raise babies. And usually the weather, it depends. Sometimes we only get like a week of feeding before the weather gets better, and then nectar flows are there, kicked in, and then they don't want the sugar water anymore. So that's another reason why you wouldn't want to load them down with a bunch of sugar water, because they might not take it, after a week or so. If they take it, then you can step it up if you want. Again, keep your eye on the temperatures, to see what's going on. And again, this is to stimulate brood production. Depending on weather and nectar flows, you can remove the feeders, add supers and cleaning excluders towards the end of March, beginning of April. And this is to ensure, especially if you're going to use queen excluders, you really need to give them time to get used to the queen excluders and go through them. I think you'll hear a lot of people talk about queen excluders, and they call them bee excluders. And I think that might be because they're like slapping them on too late, like right before a nectar flow happens. and the bees are going to be reluctant to go through this. But if you put it on early enough, they get used to it. They're like, oh, I'm not afraid of it. I'll go through it. And we'll talk about more if we got time about ways to encourage them if they're being stubborn. But usually I've never had to do any of that. They go right through the excluder and it's fine. Place queen excluders under the honey supers. So under the honey supers and in between the brood boxes. And never have a super with drawn comb on if you're feeding in the spring, because they're going to fill it with sugar water, and that's funny, honey. It's okay to have a feeder on if you're trying to get them to draw out the supers, though. But again, you want to keep an eye on it, because if they start feeling that, it's not a major tragedy. If that happens, just mark the frame funny honey so you don't accidentally extract that. Usually by the end of March, the beginning of April, we've got 2 supers on, and we're like ready for the flows, major flows. Place top screen on top of the honey supers. These are not going to have to work as hard regulating temps if you're using a top screen to cool the hive. So it's more of a major issue when the weather really starts getting hot, but it does help the honey to cure faster, and they have to do less fanning to evaporate the water. So of course, any jobs that we can alleviate for them, that's what we want to do, because then they can go out and concentrate on collecting pollen, nectar, those things, and instead of trying to regulate temperatures and curing honey. Comb replacement schedule or obtain drawn comb. This is a great time. The spring is like the best time for new comb. They're going to be reluctant as the season goes on to draw out comb, and certain breeds of bees, they're super efficient and they're stingy when it comes to wax making, and they might not even if you're feeding, they don't want to draw it out. And Carnies and Russians or tend to be that way. Italians, they're usually great wax producers, but they blow through their resources pretty quickly because they need all those resources to generate that wax. There should be a minimum of 3 deep frames of brood or 5 medium frames before placing any foundation or drawing comb supers on at this time, because if you just give them a bunch of empty comb, they really don't have the population to even deal with that yet. And so you really need a lot of young nurse bees who can generate that wax in order to do good comb replacement. And so with less than that, you're going to have to wait for more brood buildup or add more brood, maybe requeen if that's the issue. If you place foundation on too early, they may rob the wax to cap brood. And I won't even talk about plastic foundation. That's a whole other beast at this time. And I don't want to get sidetracked, but this is mainly for wax foundation here. By the 1st of April, dandelions are usually everywhere, but again, it's the temps that are a huge issue. If you're still trying to draw a comb, continue to feed for another week or so and see if they take it. You generally want to stop feeding around April 15th. It just, again, depends on the temperatures. If hives haven't populated by this point, there's a problem, and it's usually a queen problem. Give the queen until mid-April to prove herself, or requeen if necessary. I've done this too, where you just give her all the chances in the world. Like, I'll wait another week. I'm like, and then and then it's like, crap, I waited too long, And summer in particular is generally the problems, with waiting too long, because you're on the very crunch time, for fall. But again, you don't want to miss nectar flows because of a failing queen. Some hives are going to have enough brood to start a nuke. So we're talking about over winter colonies here, of course, nothing that you just started, like from a package or a nuke. And so all of this talk, I guess I should say that, is over winter colonies here. New colonies are different. You have to feed them and so forth. If you pull brood too soon, it's going to affect your honey crop, because it takes bees to make bees, it takes bees to make honey, and sometimes it's hard to have bees and honey. But it depends on the colony. Swarm prevention, sometimes you only need 1 or 2 frames to pull from a hive to make a nuke. or give that to a weaker colony. And we'll talk more about swarm prevention and control in a minute. Be cautious of nighttime temps when you're making a nuke because of chill brood and frozen bees. It's still usually if we're in the 50s at nighttime, it's usually okay. Packages, if you have or can get a deep frame of brood covered in nurse bees, it's going to greatly help the package development. And so I think more people are starting to sell nukes, starting to sell brood frames, which I think is fabulous. I mean, this is the whole point of, why we're doing this, is to try to make a little bit of money back on this deal, but then also help out, other beekeepers. And so, many more beekeepers are making their own nukes and things like that, and that's great. But it is important that they get inspected by the state before they start, distributing brood frames. If you add another deep frame, you might get honey for that package. It's possible because, you're adding more, resources to that colony. And so the more bees that they have, the more that colony is going to be healthy and productive. By the 1st of May, the hive should be busting. Major brood buildup will result in 4, 5, or 6 deep frames of brood. And this is where it gets scary. Be on alert for swarm prevention and control. You should be inspecting your hives every 7 days, every 7 to 10 days outside of a major nectar flow. And that's so we can stay ahead of queen cells. On the 8th day is when a queen will emerge. And at that time, the colony can swarm. And so we're trying to prevent that and stay ahead of whatever they're thinking and planning. And we don't want to lose, half of our bees and half of our honey. You do not want to let your hive swarm, or so you're going to lose your honey harvest, or it's going to greatly diminish, your production there. It's an excellent time, again, for comb replacement at this time. Nukes and packages, if you were feeding them, which you might have to. I mean, technically speaking, packages, you definitely have to feed them initially because they're comprised of mostly nurse bees they don't have any foragers, so they don't have a way to get food. So this is why for the first several weeks, you need to feed them sugar water. Nukes, technically speaking, they are a little mini colony that's ready to rock and roll with foragers, all ages of bees. But again, it depends on the weather, and sometimes they might need a little help and encouragement. And so you might have to feed them as well. But generally towards mid to late May, again, depending on when you get your package and the weather, you can stop feeding them. This means they're bringing enough nectar and you don't need to feed anymore. Our honey extraction sometimes starts in mid-May to ensure we get specialized honey. It just depends on when the locusts bloom, what's blooming at what time, tulip poplar, etc. First is apple honey, which I haven't been able to get a big harvest in years. I'll just be able to get just a little bit just for personal reserves, and that's it. I'm kind of like bees in the sense that I have a little stash of honey, and I even have it labeled in mirrors like wine and stuff. And I won't ever get rid of it. Then there's black locust, followed by tulip poplar, clover, and thistle in July. And of course, there's other minor, nectar flows happening, and it depends on where your hives are, and what they're located near. Mite treatment. So these are some things to consider when choosing your medications. Timing for the honey supers, because if you're using, APIARIES, that's a pesticide synthetic chemical, and you absolutely cannot have your honey supers on while you're using that treatment, and that treatment's like a 45-day treatment. So you want to be sure that that treatment's done before you put your honey supers on. Formic acid you can use while you have the honey supers on, but I just prefer not to, especially with that stuff. That stuff is potent, and I just can't imagine that smell and whatnot getting in the honey. And so my preferred method is not to treat at all while I have my honey supers on, except for now, I will say with oxalic acid, with the vapor, you can take the honey supers off and then treat and then put your honey supers back on. So we still have to be concerned about the numbers creeping up on us, even during, honey harvest time, and not just wait until July or whatever, then to try to combat these numbers. I really think you need to be vigilant about mites all the time. So temperature, certain treatments are temperature dependent, formic acid, APIARIES, and so the temps have to be right in order for it to activate. And the colony strength and health, so you wouldn't want to use formic on a package or a nuke or a weak colony. It'll kill them. Possible side effects from the medications, again, formic, that's like the nuclear bomb, and it has some negative side effects where the queen can stop laying for 2 weeks. There can be queen loss, there can be absconding. But if I haven't used formic in years because I'm a big chicken when it comes to formic. I had too many bad experiences with it. Using it in the fall. Now, I think if you're going to use it, you could probably get away with using it in the spring, because if something bad happens, then you've got time to try to fix it. If you rock the boat in fall with this treatment, and then something happens to the queen, then can you get another queen? I'm sure you probably can't get another queen, developed and mated at that point, and then and all of that. So a spring treatment for formic is probably better than fall. Common spring problems, we have European foul brood, bacterial. I won't go too much into detail because I don't want to make this big old IPM talk. Nosema apis, parasite, and of course we still have to worry about cererinate as well, Nosema cererinate. Chalk brood, it's a fungal. And most of these clear up with the onset of good nectar flows, nutrition, and colony buildup. They're really considered stressor diseases because they're just coming out of winter. They're kind of weakened. Their numbers are weakened, and it takes some time to try to build up and get numbers back, but then resources, honey and food as well. And so they usually clear up after it happens. Sometimes, most of the textbooks say to requeen if you're experiencing these problems, but I disagree with that, because I don't think it's the queen's fault, not unless she's not laying well. If she's not laying well, then yeah, off with her head and get rid of her. But these diseases and problems aren't always the queen's fault that this is happening. So if anything, you could create a brood break and cage the queen. Somehow they have different types of cages and so forth that you can confine her to a frame, and then give them a chance to catch up. But the first and foremost best way to fix this problem is adding more nurse bees. That is the reset to loads of problems and issues with colonies, is young bees. They need young bees. You wouldn't want to add old bees, because number one, they're going to fight because they're foragers. And then number two, they're going to die soon. So you want the young bees. Those are the girls that clean house, feed the babies, and do all those different jobs. So swarm management. So swarm prevention, control, and management. Swarm prevention is the steps taken by the beekeeper to reduce chances of swarming before the signs are seen. This is the area you always want to be in. You never want to be in swarm control, because that's like trying to play catch up. That's the actions after you've seen visible signs in the colony that they're preparing to do this. And we're really fighting their urge, and it's hard-coded in their DNA to swarm. Bees want to do two things. They want to reproduce and get food to reproduce. That's it. They don't care about pollination or anything. And so we're trying to fight this natural, innate, instinct here to keep them at home, but then also produce all of this stuff for us, babies, honey, and all of that. And so it's a very fine line that we run here. And swarm management, this is how Randy Oliver defines it. Swarm management consists of somehow coaxing our colonies into storing honey beyond their needs, rather than following their natural reproductive urges. So again, we're fighting nature here trying to keep them at home and get all this honey for us. So this is where I kind of pared down a lot of this, and we're just going to jump into like the signs that you see here. And swarm preparation begins 2 to 4 weeks before the prime swarm leaves. So they already know what they're doing, weeks in advance. So warning signs, flora is going to be abundant. Spring is their time to shine, reproduce, and to swarm. Bees can swarm all the way until October if the conditions are right, but spring is the best time. And so, of course, flora is going to be abundant. Nectar and pollen intake is going to be coming in like hand over fist there. So the colony is going to be strong before and during the nectar flow. So you already got a really strong colony before the nectar flow hits. So once the nectar flow hits, it's just boom. Not a lot of open cells and lots of cat brood. The queen needs spaces to lay. That bottom line. Once one frame of sealed brood will, when they emerge as adult bees, are going to cover roughly 3 frames. So it's going to get very congested in there very quickly. And having all of these bees like in the brood area, the brood nest, really ticks off the nurse bees. But get out of here, foragers. We're trying to feed the babies. And so it only takes one little nurse bee to be like, that's it, we're swarming. And then everybody follows suit with it. Not only is the population about to explode, but the parent colony can recover its workers quickly after the swarm leaves. So they really don't want to leave, the one hive hanging. And so this is why they usually build so many swarm cells. So chances are one of those queens are going to come out and get mated. But sometimes they don't care. And, and some breeds of bees will literally swarm themselves to death as well until there's like nothing left. More drones are often reared, fewer and fewer eggs are laid by the queen. You're going to see backfilling, and it's basically there's just no more room for anything. And your honey is meeting, your cat brood there. So there should be some space like in between your honey. If it's a classic, not all bees do this though. They don't do that classic pollen wagon wheel there where you've got the honey in the corners and then the pollen arch and then younger bees and then the cat brood in the middle. Not all bees do that, but most do. Sudden or abundant production of queen cups or play cups. So like if your colony really wasn't doing this before, now you start to see, all of them happening. They could be telling you that, we're building these, we're getting ready to do this. Of course, if you see charged queen cells, you're now in control. You're out of prevention mode. You're now in control mode. And a lot of these warning signs are control, not prevention. Usually the swarm cells are usually going to be at the bottom of the frames, but not always. They go berserk where they put these things sometimes. And so one frame can have like 15 queen cells on it. It's crazy. And then they get really sneaky where they hide them too. Like they'll put them in funky drone comb. And if you miss one of them, that's all it takes is for you to miss one, and then they leave. Swarm cells will be many. And so this ensures that at least one of these, virgin queens are going to come out and hopefully get mated and come back. When producing supersedure or emergency cells, only a few are made. And so you might only have like 3, and they're usually made all at the same time, and they're going to be about the same age and the same length, whereas the swarm cells, they make them like every day. Swarm cells are generally the same age, while swarm cells vary in age. The first swarm queen cells made are given the best attention. And so if you're into, trying to raise your own queens, which you should be, then those are the ones that you want to select, but you also want to select ones that are more heavily dimpled. Excuse me, backup cells are generally not as good or well cared for because sometimes, like I said, they get crazy and they just start making these things and maybe they're not caring for all of them as well as they should be. And so those of medium length and heavily dimpled marbled are usually good. And the ones that are smooth or long or the poor queen cells. So this one you can see right here, like they really doted over this, took care of it. They spent time on this. They love this queen. Over here, this is just like, whatever, we're just crazy, you know, building stuff. And maybe she got fed well, maybe she didn't.
Hey, Jen, quick question for you.
Uh-huh.
So if you got a bunch of these swarm cells there, do you have a preferred method of removing the cap swarm cells to either place in another frame, another hive?
I haven't done it that way. I've just removed the whole frame.
The whole frame?
Yeah, because I'm heavy into brood manipulation with hives and hive equalization. And so for me, it's just quicker just to swap the whole frame out than it is to like cut the queen cell off and then try to pin it on there. And it's just like, just they can have the whole frame. Who cares?
I mean, I've tried taking them off with a razor, you know, and sometimes you're unsure, am I cutting into the cell or?
Yeah. And I don't trust my skills doing that either. So it's like, just give them the whole frame. Just swap out the frames.
Thank you.
So these, of course, are queen cups. Probably everybody's familiar with that, or play cups. They're generally called play cups when there's nothing inside of them. But some people also call them queen cups too, which can be confusing. Now they become charged queen cells or queen cups or queen cells when they put larvae in them. So you always got to look at these play cups just to see what they're planning, and don't go crazy like chopping everything off and up and everything until you determine, is she still there? What has happened? So right here, these are Randy Oliver's pictures here. And so this is a swarm cell picture here where you can see there's tons of them, you know, on the bottom. Believe it or not, this is a swarm cell picture as well. And of course, Randy Oliver knows what he's talking about, but we can also tell that it is swarm cells because look at all of those bees there and look at all that cap brood. If those were super seeder cells, you probably wouldn't see that population like it is. It'd probably be suffering in some way. So those are swarm cells as well. And these are swarm cells. And so the major indication here, even though they kind of look like they're the same size, is that this is a plastic frame which did not get drawn out well. And so there's no room for her to lay. So they want to leave. Sometimes they do that, you know, of course, like it would have been smarter for them to stay, draw the comb out, then they would, you know, have it. But sometimes you have to fight them, a lot of times with plastic, and then they get it in their heads that this is what they want to do, and so they'll start making these preparations here. So this is why it's important that they have enough drawn out comb and good, well drawn out comb, not wonky half drawn out comb. So before swarming occurs, you want to decide what your swarm management is going to be and your objectives. You know, do you want bees or do you want honey? You know, it's very hard sometimes to have both because I know people really, you know, they want both. And sometimes people, you just got to make a choice. If you want more hives, well, then if you're not buying the bees and you're splitting your colonies and making nukes from what you have, then you're reducing the workforce. If you think of your colony like a factory with all of these bees in there as, you know, all of your workers, then anytime you take workers away from this assembly line, it's going to affect the colony. And so if you keep breaking it down, then you're not going to get honey. But if you keep them all together, then you're going to get, you know, more honey. So I think there's a time to do nukes and splits like that. And I would say the time to do that is right after your bees or nectar flow. So probably like June is the time to be making nukes and splits. Your decision is going to dictate your swarm control and prevention techniques. And there's a fine line between running strong hives or honey production hives and keeping them off the streets swarming. So swarm prevention, again, this is where you always want to be. There's several methods that can be time consuming and risky. The Damari method, checkerboarding, Snell Grove method, replacing brood frames with foundation or foundationless frames. And there's other methods using equipment such as slatted bottom boards, tearing off boards, some people call crown boards, inner covers, and clean excluders. I mean, you can play around and experiment with all of these things, you know, if you've got the time, the money, and the resources to do it. Beekeeping is about risk and odds. And if you only have 2 colonies, you probably really can't not afford to be playing around with all these different techniques and so forth. If you have many colonies, then maybe you can afford to do this. And if you have the time, because some of them can be very time consuming. The easiest method is just simply opening up the brood nest and doing hive manipulation or brood manipulation and hive equalization. And this is simply done by removing a frame or 2 of brood and giving it to a weaker colony. You usually always have a colony that is not just kind of a little bit behind, whether, you know, there's a lot of school of thought that people are like, don't coddle, you know, weak bees, because, and that means like genetically speaking, we don't want these to survive, but bees have a lot of problems. And so it's not always a genetic issue. And so I prefer to help the bees out all season long. And then if it was genetics that, you know, did them in, then at least I did try these other methods and to try to get them through. And so it's always better, you know, to help out these colonies with resources. The removal of brood frames is going to decrease your population for a short period in a strong colony, and it's going to give the space, you know, the queen more space to lay. If you have drawn comb to put back in it, that can be problematic for beginners starting out and not having enough drawn comb. And so it's going to allow also more space for the bees to congregate and be in there. And it kind of shocks them back into the regular routine. It's like, oh, wait a minute, we've got empty cells here. So we either got to be cleaning them, we got to be filling them with stuff. And then, oh, the queens lay babies in them. So yeah, now we got to take care of the babies. And you can make a nuke or a split with those removed brood frames. If, you know, all of your hives are equal in population, then sure, make a little nuke or, you know, split with it and see what happens with it, play around with it. And spring is the best time to do experimentation in all of these sorts of things, because it's kind of hard to go wrong in the spring. But as the season goes on, you want to be more conservative about some of the things that you do. Or help a weaker colony. Again, that's always my favorite to do with the brood frames. And you do not, absolutely, whatever you do not remove nurse bees from the brood frames. Those bees need to go along with that brood to take care of those babies, regardless if you're putting it in a weak colony or obviously if you're making a nuke or a split, they don't even have nurse bees in there. That's a new colony. So they need those bees to go along to take care of those babies. But if you're putting it in a weaker colony, well, they're weak population wise, so they might not have the nurse bees to take care of these young bees. And they're like, well, great, now you just gave us more work to do that we can't do it. And so we might just cannibalize. And often that's what they do. They'll just eat the babies. Replace brood with empty drawn comb. Use good comb with not a lot of drone cells, because of course, you know, drones and mites, it just promotes that more. But, you know, with that said, you're still going to have mites laying in worker cells as well. But of course, they prefer the drone cells more. So during strong nectar flows, you should be inspecting your hives again every 7 days for all of these swarm behaviors and signs, every 7 to 10 outside of nectar flow. Strong hives with well-populated brood frames and good laying patterns should be like no-brainer, right? Watch them more carefully for this swarm activity. And make sure that your colony has enough empty comb, drawn out comb for the queen to lay. And there's going to be many variables, you know, that are going to dictate your hive buildup mites, forage capabilities, and weather. So, not every hive is going to act the same way every year all the time. Obviously, this hive needs to be thinned out a little bit. This is Randy Oliver's picture too. And so like that's just bananas, like how many bees are in there. This was one of my colonies, and you can tell that it's in the spring because I've got my queen excluder on, I've got my supers, and now this was taken after I'd already gotten in the colony, so everybody's all fired up there, but it was still a lot of bees. And there was a week that it was like on the 8th day I came back, and there was swarm cells everywhere. And I was really bummed because I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to remove like all of these frames in here, and this is going to affect my honey production. Nope. She put them right back. I mean, every once in a while you'll get this fantastic colony that can do it all, and but then they ended up absconding. So it's better to remove too much brood than not enough. You can always go back, put it back later. Brood frames can be replaced a week later if it's discovered too much has been taken. Methods that don't work for swarm prevention: queen clipping. And that's when the practice, which is, I think, kind of barbaric, they clip the wings. And back in the old days, like the left queen, if they clip the left wing, it was either the years that ended on even or odd, which determined the right wing clip, then the opposite. And it's just, the concept is that she's not going to go anywhere. She's not going to fly, but that means nothing, because the queen doesn't decide any of this process. She is just a pawn in all of it. The bees are bossy, and they tell the workers, and they tell her what to do. And workers might kill the queen trying to get her to fly with the swarm. So they're going to get her out on the ground. She can't fly, and they're going to eventually give up, if they haven't already killed her in the process. And then they're going to go back in the colony. And most of the time they hurt her on the ground, abandon her, and then they just go right back in the colony and leave with one of the virgin queens that emerge. And adding more boxes. Now, this might be a temporary fix, but it's not a very good fix because bees like to cluster. So in the winter, they have a very tight cluster, but in the summer, it's a loose cluster. So they like being around each other. Just because you put these empty boxes on top doesn't mean that they're going to, bam, automatically start occupying all of these boxes. So it might take them a little while to be like, oh, okay, we got more space. And maybe it'd take a minute for the queen to realize, like, oh, okay, so there's more boxes up there. And by that point, again, they probably already decided they were going to swarm anyway. So adding additional boxes may temporarily help with swarm prevention, but it usually only delays the inevitable. And adding more boxes and having empty boxes only, invites critters, wax moths, and small hive beetles. And you do want to have your 2 supers on during, intense major nectar flows, because obviously you want to get honey, but these supers do provide a temporary, I guess you'd say, like a hotel room for them to stay in overnight and not be down in the brood nest taking off the nurse bees. More methods that don't work: excluders or swarm guards. The concept is that she's too fat to get through this queen excluder, but joke's on you because they've been chasing her around for a couple weeks, getting her lean enough to fly. So there is a possibility that she could get through the queen excluder anyway. But if she can't get through it, then they're probably going to kill her in the process anyway, because they don't understand, why can't you get your fat butt through this queen excluder? And of course, virgin queens are definitely probably going to be small enough to slip through there, and then they'll just swarm with the virgin queen. And virgins who escaped and have returned mated, maybe like their rear end's too big now and they can't get through it. And of course, drones, they're just too fat and chunky; they can't get through the queen excluder at all. So if you find a charge or cap queen cell, before you get crazy, just chopping off, like, oh, you're freaking out, panicking, you see all these swarm cells, verify that they haven't already swarmed. And so the best way to do that, and this might take a little bit of doing, is to try to track that queen down and figure out, because if you kill these queen cells, then you're ruining their way of being able to queen themselves. And then you will have to, either go buy a queen to introduce, or, put eggs in there and start that process over again. So remove brood frames and replace the drawing comb in there if you have it. And because just cutting off the queen cells and replacing doesn't work, because you're not addressing the original problem was there's not enough room for her to lay. And so they need those empty cells, to be able to lay. And the queen cells, just cutting them off, or still have the pheromones on there, so it's still like they're still puts them into swarm mode, and so all they're going to do is just build those queen cells back again. And so again, you might be temporarily delaying the situation, but again, if you missed one of those queen cells, they're leaving, and again, they get really sneaky where they hide it. They're already on their path to swarm, especially if the cell's capped, because that's when like all bets are off, all gloves are off. They can go at any given moment once that queen cell gets capped. Pheromones are still present, and you're not going to relieve the congestion problem, the original issue. And you can place frames with cells in a nuclear split and let them queen themselves. And again, this is a great way, like your hives made it through winter. You should have a party for that queen, that colony, celebrate that, and definitely try to continue those good genetics. So be making your own nukes and splits and let them queen themselves. And again, springtime is the best time to do that, and continue those good genetics. If you find charged or cut queen cells, you can cut them off and clean with a new queen and a nuke, or a split. If you're, that's probably the worst option, really, but if you're trying to hurry up and build up your colonies and quickly, then, remember, it takes about a month for a queen to be a queen, for her to develop and then become sexually mature, go get mated and all of that. So if you're under a time crunch, then you go buy a new queen. Or cut the queen cells off, place it in a weaker hive. Usually I find, it doesn't, they'll take care of that queen cell. They're already queen, right? And so they're going to kill that queen cell. It's not going to then put them into swarm mode. They're a weak colony. Where are they going? So do not remove the nurse bees and workers again, because they need to go along with those brood frames to take care of the babies. If the old queen is still present, you can create an artificial swarm by moving her into a new colony. Sometimes this discourages the whole process, and it's like, boom, there, you swarmed. Are you happy? Are you going to stop now? Usually they don't. Because again, if you're not, alleviating brood nest issues, and of course, and that can get really tricky, because you have to let that colony then queen themselves. And then if they're still have that urge to swarm, they could still swarm. But that is a better way to get a better quality queen, is to let that hive produce, because they have all the resources and honey and bees to be able to feed these queens really well. But again, you're running a fine line from them still wanting to swarm, because they still have these queen cells to do that with. If queen cells are missed, hive can still swarm. So final notes on swarming: it does provide brood breaks, which are good for varroa control. However, the parent colony is weak, and there's lots of cap brood that are left behind, and that usually drone brood too, because remember, drones just get reared more, and so you've got a lot of varroa that are getting ready to emerge. So I don't know if it really cancels each other out as far as the brood break goes. Most are young workers leaving the swarm, and that can be damaging to the brood and the parent colony. And you've also created an age imbalance within your colony, and it takes time for that hive to recover. You never want age imbalances happening, because again, remember, your hive like a factory, and all your different ages of bees are part of your assembly line. And responsible beekeepers just shouldn't let their hives swarm, because the general public really gets freaked out about them too. It doesn't matter how many times we tell them, they're gentle, this, that, and the other. They get freaked out. But, again, like you're losing all your bees, your honey, they're knocking you back down to a nuke level. And who wants to be there, right? And back in the olden days, that's how they actually split their colonies. And it was like an event. They would set out lawn chairs and like watch them swarm 20 feet up in a tree. And it's like, how are you going to get that now? It's like, it's better to be more proactive and intervene on this process and actually be the one who splits the colonies, makes new colonies, and so forth. How am I doing on time? You're still muted, Ed.
You're spot on.
So you think we got time to go into the honey production?
Sure.
I don't think it's that long. Maybe another half hour tops, maybe.
Okay, that'll put us right at 9 o'clock.
Excellent. All right, so honey and co-production. So there's going to be many different techniques and methods, and it's going to depend on all those variables. And this is going to directly affect your results. And so this goes for honey. This goes for any pretty much goal that you have in beekeeping, is that you always have to account for all of these variables. And so, of course, foraging capabilities, they have to have, the nectar-bearing plants to be able to get the nectar. The colony strength, if the colony is weak, nobody's going to be very effective at doing anything. Weather conditions, it's too cold, nobody's going anywhere. Time of year, what do you see blooming in winter? Nectar-bearing plants, like hardly nothing. Now, of course, if we're down south and we're experiencing, no winter, then things are going to be different. Pest, mite, disease problems, if they really have a lot of viral issues and pest problems, then that's going to affect everything. Budget, usually the more colonies you have, the more honey that you're going to get. But if you are on a tight budget and you only have a couple colonies, then of course you're not going to get as much honey. Again, quantity of hives. Goals. What are your goals? Do you want bees or do you want honey? It's hard to have both, and especially if you only have 2 colonies, it's hard. We tell beekeepers to start out with 2 colonies, to get your feet wet and get the experience underneath your belt, but you really need to start thinking beyond 2 colonies, because if our losses are anywhere from 40 to 60%, your odds aren't very good with 2 colonies. And so if we want it to be truly sustainable and not have to buy bees every year, hopefully if we have 10 to 20 colonies, hopefully half of them survive, and it takes bees to make bees so we can recoup our losses from the colonies that need it. Most of this discussion is going to depend on these variables, and I'll also discuss the majority of results. Of course, there's always exceptions, but these are proven techniques, and some of these are just basic biological facts here. And so these discussions are a foundation for you to build upon, for you to try all these different techniques and see, what your results are going to be. But, get the basics underneath your belt first, learn the biology, the behavior of the bees, and then you can start playing around with all these other techniques. So first and foremost, you have to understand the nectar flows. This is, what's feeding your bees, how they're getting all their nutrients and health. So you have to learn what grows around them. And there's many resources on the internet, and you might have to do some cross-checking in some places with grow zones, and does this plant grow in your area and things like that. But you also need to understand the bloom times of when they bloom, and also the nutritional values, because just because it's a flowering plant doesn't mean it produces a lot of nectar or any nectar, and also not all pollen is equal. Some pollen's garbage. Actually, dandelion pollen isn't very nutritional, but it makes up for what it lacks because so much of it grows. So it's important to understand the different values, the crude protein levels and things like that. Did somebody ask something? No? Okay. By learning your region's plants, you're going to be able to schedule your population buildup, your maintenance, and honey production accordingly. You know, basically, by one, how you're going to take care of your colonies, not just for honey production. Plants produce different amounts of nectar each year, and whether it's going to affect your crop average. And nectar flows usually last about 10 to 14 days. This is the bloom times, but of course they can be cut short if we get a lot of rain. And we've been in May, we've gotten hail before during the locust flow. And tulip poplar is a very fragile flower, and so if we get a lot of rain, it can really affect that. For that. So the nectar flows, we're just gonna kind of go over what starts blooming for nectar and pollen, and how the bees build up with the growth of the plants, because remember, they're very tied in to the plants here. So in February to April, we have different species of maple that are budding. Not so great as far as nectar goes. They do provide a little bit of nectar, but it's more for pollen. And then it's always fun to talk about skunk cabbage because it's such a weird, gross little plant here. But what's important about this, while it offers no nectar, and the pollen, like the bees aren't even interested in the pollen. Most of the time, these plants get pollinated by all of your carrion types of insects, your flies, wasps, and hornets, and things like that. But what's important about this plant is you see it's blooming in the snow. So this is one of the first plants that are going to be growing here. And they use the skunk cabbage during their foraging flights to use them as little pit stops and warming stations to be able to get back home. So just because it doesn't offer, nectar or pollen, doesn't mean it's a worthless plant. Autumn olive, this is where stuff really starts like ramping up. And yes, it's an invasive species. Kind of sometimes beekeepers and master gardeners and native plant people don't really agree on these plants. But it's a very good source for the bees at this time of year. And so I say, yay, they need it. And then the mustards as well, another great source. Now, these honeys tend to be a little bit bitter, but it's more of a personal preference as far as honey goes. Some people like that. It usually produces a very light honey, beautiful color of honey, and a lot of your early fool's harvest will have autumn olive and mustard in it, and you can taste the bitterness in it. And also keep that in mind if you're submitting that to a honey fair, and if you get a really, critical judge on the taste factor, which I really think they need to take that out, because I think that is so, anyway, but it can get points deducted for the taste. Willow, they love willow as well. And coltsfoot kind of looks like dandelion, but it grows closer to the ground. And then of course we have our dandelion. And this is our major nectar flow. This is the big bang. So as you can see, they kind of like build up over the season for the locust flow. And this is the mid-Atlantic. Of course, if you're in a different region, you might have different plant sources, but I have talked to a lot of beekeepers in the mid-Atlantic, and pretty much that is their major nectar flow as well. And we do have, these little micro, climates and environments where, you might have something else growing there that the bees are interested in at that time. Whatever's blooming at that time with the highest sugar content and value is what they're going to be foraging on. So it just so happens locust at this time, it's the major, sugar content, and bees have evolved to be super efficient. I mean, they have to be. They're only alive 6 weeks in the spring and summer. So they have to be very focused on what they're doing. And so they're going to go for the most bang for the buck, and this happens to be the locust. And which can be problematic with the tulip poplar, because the tulip poplar sometimes has overlapping bloom times. And so they might not be paying attention to the tulip poplar at that time. But again, depends on where you're at, how many, you know, sources you got growing there, and of course the temperature, because again, and the weather, because again, if the weather starts raining a lot, but as you can see with that tulip poplar flower, it's shaped like a cup. So if we get a lot of rain, it just washes the nectar away. So by the time the bees can get out to go get anything, it's gone. With the black locust, the what are they called? They're not called, are they called racemes? Yes, racemes. Or kind of downward. And so they kind of get protected. Oh, well, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, anyway, I only want to go back like one action there. And there we go. As you can see, the racemes are growing down. So they're kind of protected from the rain. But if we get high winds or hail, then that's going to destroy the flower. Then, like I said, by the time they get out, there's nothing left for them to get. And then we have the different species of clover that grow throughout the year, which are good sources. But then after the black locust, it's kind of downhill from there as far as, you know, nectar flows go. And you'll start to see the colony change perhaps because they're not seeing, you know, all of that nectar coming in. And so they're kind of pulling back maybe on rearing babies. And you'll definitely see a change in making babies, you know, in the late summer, especially if you're not feeding one-to-one sugar water. And then thistle produces a really nice honey. And the important thing about it, well, there's lots of different varieties of thistle, but this one, particularly the bull thistle, it usually blooms in July. So this is a really important time because there's not much growing at that point for them. But the problem is a lot of times farmers cut them up, and so you might only have them growing around, you know, borders and hedgerows and things. Alfalfa, if you're lucky enough to have, you know, a farmer that you can put your bees next to them, then do it. It's a great honey as well. But it takes a lot of times communication with the farmer because a lot of times they have to cut it before, you know, the pests start affecting the flower, the plant. Basswood, don't have a lot of that around here anymore. It's more of a southern plant or tree. But again, it depends on where you are. If you're more southern Virginia, West Virginia, you're going to have some more basswood. Staghorn sumac, I hate this plant. It is such a terrible weed and grows so crazy. However, it has an important nectar source at that time of year too, because it usually blooms in July, and this is when they desperately need it. So production hives. So you're going to have to, if you don't already have a colony that is already booming, it looks like it has all these great traits, you know, like brood production, foraging, and, you know, of course, like I said, these are the traits that you're looking for. This is what everybody wants, but you don't always get all of these traits all together in one colony. And so again, having, you know, several colonies, you can kind of pick and choose like which one is going to be maybe your brood producer, your wax producer, or your honey production. Not often will you have a colony that can just do it all, but you can make one. And you're going to do that by adding lots of young foragers and wax secretors. And it's going to be accomplished by simply adding more bees and brood. So if you just pick out a favorite colony, and if you've got resources to steal from other colonies, then you want to build that colony up. And when your hive is then populated and ready for honey production, there should be 1 to 2 frames of honey and nectar frames, 1 pollen frame, and 7 deep brood frames. Now, if this was a triple medium, of course, you need to, you know, multiply that by 2 or 3, because it's roughly 2 medium frames equal the size of a deep frame. But as you can see, like, it is going to explode here very soon. And if you're trying to quickly build it up, it is better, obviously, to take capped brood than it would be to take uncapped brood, because that brood still needs time to develop. But keep in mind, you are kind of creating age imbalances here too. It's usually never a big problem in the spring, and they figure it all out. If there's more nectar or pollen frames, you want to remove them and replace with frames of brood from another hive, which has all stages of brood, because it is important to have these stages, because you always want these different stages coming up. But if you're trying to do something quick and dirty, like give them all that cat brood, because bam, that's getting ready to explode. But keep in mind, it's getting ready to explode. So like, don't go plan a vacation somewhere. Well, just don't vacate, in May anyway. Production hives. It is essential to have a young queen in a production hive. Young queens not only going to be, more productive at laying eggs, but more importantly, her pheromone is stronger, and it's going to keep the girls in check a little bit more. So between each deep frame of brood, you should see about 4,000 to 5,000 bees. So we're building up the colony here. Early or late day is going to house twice as many bees as foragers and congregate on the tops of bars, sides of boxes, and on top of each other. I mean, you're creating a really cramped condition, and it gets scary, because you're like, oh my gosh, this is a lot of bees. And you're running a very fine line on swarming when you do this, so you really have to stay on top of them. Midday count is like 3 frames. It's 10 to 12,000 bees. A deep hive body is going to house about 20,000 to 24,000 bees. So if you put another medium on top of that, you're adding almost 2/3 more, totaling 35,000 to 40,000. If you add another one on there, you've got a really banging hive there. And it's a really strong honey production hive, but you've got to watch it. And conversely, I've heard a lot of people talk about running singles and using them as honey production, meaning they're only using like 1 deep for a brood area. I have very mixed thoughts and feelings about that. Number one, you got to watch them, because they have no room for anything at that point. But number two, it's really like slave labor in a way, and you have the intent from the get-go of stealing all of their honey at that point and not leaving them with nothing, because they absolutely have no room to put it down in the brood boxes. They're forced to use the supers at that point. But back to adding more equipment, it's not a good, swarm prevention. We already talked about that. You want to do the brood manipulation, hive equalization there. You want to keep your operation, slim and trim with not a lot of extra equipment here. And keep brood area equipment to a minimum. You're going to have to be in this hive every 7 to 10 days checking, for this colony. So you don't want all that equipment handling happening. Using a slatted bottom board can be beneficial because it provides, again, like a little hotel room for these foragers to cluster in overnight and stay out of the brood nest area, not taking off the nurse bees there. But most of them usually congregate up in the supers anyway. But if you got a really big hive, using a slatted bottom board can help. Top screens are going to help cure the honey and ventilate the hive. Bees don't have to work as hard. We already talked about that, bringing in water to cool the hive. Use 9-frame spacers to encourage the bees to build out the comb thicker. And they can pack more honey in it since they're drawing it out thicker. And it also just kind of makes it more convenient when you're ripping, like when you're taking the comb out, they're not like smack dab up against each other. And then you're uncapping it, ripping it open there. But of course, if it's a 9-frame spacer on a 10-frame box, you're reducing your frames down to 9, and on an 8-frame box, you're reducing your frames down to 7. Place the queen excluders and supers on at least 1 month before the expected nectar flows. Remember, I told you can't just, spring this queen excluder on at them at the last minute, like days before, a week before the nectar, like the locust is going to bloom, because they're just going to be like, what is this thing here? I don't want to use it. So give them plenty of time to get used to it. Excuse me. If they do still refuse, to go through the queen excluder, you can try spraying the supers with sugar water or honeybee healthy, or you could place a brood frame up into the super or it depends on your setup and configuration of how easy this can be done. Because if you're using all mediums for everything, that is the only good thing about using mediums. Don't get me started on medium setups. But everything's interchangeable there. You can just move it up into the super. But if you're running deeps and only have medium or shallow, then you would have to take it out of the super, bring it down into the deep, let them fill it with babies, and then move that frame back up. Basically, you're tricking them into going through the queen excluder to take care of the babies. And then you would just, if you're putting a shallow, if they build burr comb, if you violate bee space in any way, then you might have to cut that off, whatever. I've never had to do all this. Usually they just use it, like right away. Well, not right away, but so this is going to be your equipment setup, whether you're using a screen bottom board or a solid bottom board, goes on the bottom. Your brood boxes, that can be triple mediums, double deeps, story and a half. And then your queen excluder, and then your supers go on there, your top screen, and then your roof. There you go. That's your nectar flow setup. Like, don't add any more. Don't add any more boxes. If it's a strong hive, major nectar flow, maybe you can add on another super, but long gone are the days where, we're getting really good honey harvests and things like that, because our foraging is just not like our grandfather's way of beekeeping. Nothing's like our grandfather's way of beekeeping. New beekeepers only need 2 supers during the first year. Maybe the bees can draw up comb for the next. Your focus as a new beekeeper is supposed to get your bees through winter and not be worried about, getting honey, but sure, maybe they can draw out some comb, gives them something to do to occupy themselves. I have heard of people, actually first year beekeepers, getting some honey and extracting it, although I would recommend not doing that. I would recommend, keeping that, either removing it, freezing it, giving it back to them later or something like that, than going ahead and extract. But I know it's like really hard to resist, the honey. Experienced beekeepers could use up to 3 supers. More than that, it's just really pushing productions and stressing out your bees. Like, work, fill this, fill that, and it's just, and some of them just aren't going to do it. So it doesn't matter how much you coax them into trying to do it, they're just not going to do it. If another super is needed, you put it on the bottom because they're going to focus on that first. It's closest to the brood nest, and then rotate your boxes upwards and rotate your supers anytime you pull a super. And you also want to rotate the box as well. And that just helps promote uniform, even filling out of the frames. And add the same amount back as the supers, because that's going to house, you don't want to like initially give them this huge shock, like, oh, I just took all your supers away. And because they're like, well, wait a minute, we had all this room and now we don't. And so that could like push them over the edge into some swarm management. So if you take a super off to extract, put another box on there, hopefully with drawing comb, and it's because it's going to house those bees. Because again, you want to keep those foragers out of the bird nest. If not trying to get cut comb, place 3 frames of foundation in every super and brood box when possible to get fresh comb. Like, you always want to get comb, and then you got to protect it from the wax moths. That's the follow-up part thing there. So comb production. So it's really similar to a honey production hive. You want to pick, your best colony to get your cut comb here. And you really need a strong colony to do it, strong nectar flow to do it. And so spring is the best time for trying to get some cut comb. A good nectar flow and young queen are essential, and there's several types of ways to achieve cut comb. They've got lots of gadgets out there. They've got the Ross rounds, they've got the hog cassettes, wooden sections, plastic sections, foundationless frames, just sticking an empty frame down in there and letting them draw out. That's fine. The Romanoff frames, and then the cut comb foundation. That's been our preferred method because it just, sometimes if you give them an empty foundationless frame, bees can get a little bit crazy on how they're building the wax. They don't always follow the comb building playbook there. And so if you give them a cut comb, the thin surplus foundation kind of gives them a guideline, like straight down, this is how you're going to build it, and not cross combing and things like that. But it really boils down to how you want to market and package your cut comb as well, because like with the Ross Rounds and the Hall cassettes, it's actually built into that whole package that you're going to then sell. And so you can't do like chunk and cut comb, really. I mean, you could, but you have to go in there and cut it out of the boxes and all that stuff. And so that's why doing like either like the foundationless frame or just a cut comb frame, it gives you more flexibility to be able to cut the chunk to the sizes that you need in the cut comb as well. For cut comb types using foundations, you don't want to place it on too early. You want to do it like right before the nectar flow starts, because if you do that, they're more than likely going to make Swiss cheese out of that foundation, and you really can't reuse it. I mean, you can reuse it at that point, but it just kind of destroys it. And a lot of times they never really go back and fill it in properly either. Place five cut comb frames in the middle of the 2 supers, and they're going to produce beautiful cut comb within 6 to 12 days, weather permitting. Do not add more foundation to supers or brood boxes when you're trying to achieve cut comb, because you really want them to focus on that cut comb and like nothing else. And if you try to give them all this foundation to draw out, then they might not draw it out as well, or delay it, or something like that. And within 6 days, you want to like reverse the boxes and rotate them from front to back, because this is again going to promote uniform filling and drawing out of the comb, but it also kind of reduces travel stains. And travel stains are where all their little feet, dirty little feet, and the propolis walk all over the comb. And again, if you're just selling it, usually consumers don't know the difference, between travel stains, water cappings, this, that, and the other. But if you're entering it into a fair, which can be like really, some fairs don't really judge or use standards like others. It just depends. But that is, points can be deducted for travel stains. So this just shows you want to rotate the boxes there. Reversing and rotating supers promotes uniform filling, keeps travel stains down to a minimum, produces whiter, fuller frames for cut comb. Use regular drawing comb on the outer frame. So of course they can fill that with honey. If you have pulled 3 supers with cut comb and honey supers, replace cut combs with drawn comb frames, because again, you're going to be stressing them out, and you're really pushing wax production at this point. And by this time, you've pretty much probably out of a major nectar flow anyway. Go for getting honey rather than trying or settling for poor cut comb. You can reuse drawn comb. However, usually the cut comb foundation, it's like one-shot deal, and like I said, they never really go back and fill it out very well after that. Now this frame isn't bad here, to harvest and sell, but this frame would not be good to enter into a fair that has high judging standards, because you're going to get points deducted for all these open spaces here. Now the color of it's very pretty. It's nice and white and thick. Not a lot of water cappings there. This one's a better frame here to enter into a fair. But again, if you're just selling it, consumers really don't care or know about all this. You want to remove completed cap cut comb frames as soon as possible to reduce the travel stains. Do not remove the bees with a smoker, because you could get little ash particles everywhere, and it could be absorbed the smoke flavor, unless you're going for some mesquite honey. But the smoke could absorb into the honey. Using a bee brush is not effective. You're going to be there all day long, and it's like fighting water, and bees hate bee brushes. So you're going to end up with bee parts everywhere, and it's so time consuming. Porter escapes and triangular escapes There's a waiting period to, evacuate them out of the supers. So that's going to require more trips to the bee yard. I don't know about you, but I really try to condense my trips there because I know if I come back or I have to come back, it's like, am I really going to come back or is something going to get in my way and prevent me from getting back there? So I try to do as much as I can and not have to come back until necessary. But yeah, so the concept here, it's a one-way ticket out of the supers. They can't find their way back in there. Fume boards and repellents. Downsides to this is they're very noxious. They're purposely noxious and stinky because it's kind of like the concept of formic acid, like evicting colonies out of these or bees out of the supers here. And it needs to be hot really for this to activate. And again, can require a couple trips to the bee yard till they get out of there. Best way, leaf blower. It's the simplest way. Get them all out. You don't hurt them. Now, if you're not using a queen excluder, you can't do this method because you don't want to blow the queen, to kingdom come there. But it's really, really the quickest way just to get them out, and it doesn't hurt them at all. You want to freeze any cut comb frames for 2 to 3 days, and this is to destroy any possible small hive beetle eggs in there. Chances are that time of year, if you have a colony that can produce cut comb, you probably don't have a big small hive beetle problem in there. But just be on the safe side because there's nothing grosser than coming back to a honey box and then discovering you have pests in there. Don't use upper entrance shims of any kind, like the emery shims. They actually were created to use, or the thought process was for spraying and honey harvesting. And the concept is that you're saving the bees time and trouble because they have a direct entrance into the honey supers and don't have to go, like all the way up, through the brood area. And which is true. You are providing a really quick entrance in there, but it's also a quick entrance for pollen. And so you're going to discover that your honey supers start to become full of pollen. And we don't want pollen in our honey supers. We want honey in our honey supers. So bees are going to use that as the shortest route to store pollen. And you don't want loads of pollen in your cut comb because you will get points deducted for that as well if you're entering. And actually, crazy enough, a lot of consumers, if they saw pollen in person in cells or in honey, they would think it was dirt and wouldn't want it. Yeah. So they also build lots of burr comb within this area, usually because you're violating bee space there. So as mentioned, there's going to be several ways and techniques to produce, the cut comb using the different equipment. Some techniques such as the Killian method or for more experienced beekeepers. But try it, play around with it. We encourage you because this is how you're going to learn. Sometimes it's trial by error. And when it comes to comb and honey production and things like that, but this is the fun part, and you can play around with it. It's the other things that I don't advise you playing around. Mites, don't play around with mites. So if you need any more help, I really need to change this cover really badly. It's to 2022. All the information is pretty much the same. I just got to change the cover. So that's available to download on the internet as a PDF. I'm always available, by phone, email, Facebook. You can stop by the shop. But that is it, folks.
Yay. Wow, you hit that at exactly 2059. Wow, perfect. That was an awful lot of information. Awesome information.
It is.
Does anyone have any questions? This is the time.
Well, like I said, you can review it later, come back later. Some things don't sink in until later, and then you can come back and ask me then. I'm here always for questions and help and all that good stuff.
Very much appreciate your time, and I'm also we'll go ahead and stop this recording now, and then